Hey everyone, welcome to another class. This time we are painting some loose flowers. So the reference photo is quite interesting because a lot of those background flowers are out of focus, and then we have these two main flowers. So I'll be sharing the reference photo in a second. For now, this is my painting, and you can see how vibrant the colors are because the painting is still wet, right? But then once it dried, it's still quite vibrant. That's because I was painting with the paint-like ratio, which is more like between milk and half, sometimes half and half like. And also, so I painted that first layer, and then I was lifting up the flowers and so on. And then I decided to add a little more paint, so another layer on the bottom of these two main flowers. So basically the right side of the paper, and then a little bit on the left side. So right from the start, I would have vibrancy just by having less water diluted with paint. But here's the thing, we're already painting wet on wet. We're painting over a wet surface, so that makes sense anyways. So the idea was also to have a whole bunch of different purple colors, so violet colors, to recreate similar shades, so similar tones of purples that I see in this reference photo. So the reference photo is really pretty. My painting is more on the bluish side, so it's still violets and purples, but the reference photo is more like purple-like, so you could use less ultramarine light color if you would like to. That's totally optional, and instead, for example, use bright violet as the main color. This is my sketch. So this sketch overall is not that detailed because it's a loose painting, and overall it's kind of like a landscape, and normally I don't really focus much on a sketch. So I just needed the idea where those main flowers are going to be placed. So please don't stress over too much. You just want the overall idea where the petals are going to be basically, and so you know where the sky portion is going to start. And these are the colors. So I used three different violet colors, three different tones of violet basically. Basically it's the permanent violet, cobalt violet light. Cobalt violet light is more opaque, so it's a transparent watercolor just like any other watercolors, but this one is more leaning towards opaque, so it's a little more opaque basically. And I wanted to have the variety of different violets, and that's what I saw basically in the reference photo when I was studying it. And then to create darker tone of violet, so I decided to add ultramarine light, and this is when you can decide how much of that do you want, because my painting is more on the bluish side, not as that light purple that you see, the violet that you see in the reference photo. So that's totally optional. And then yellow ochre, quinacridone red for the sky portion, just a little bit of that warmth in there overall. And then the neutral tint, indigo, these colors I used mostly for the bottom part of the flowers and just to darken up some parts, so I have some contrast, some nice contrast. And these are the brushes. So the main brush, I suppose all of them were pretty main. So the Stroke Flat 3/4 Heritage series, I used it first to wet the background and so on, but then I switched to the flat wash 1.5 series Heritage, and that's because I just wanted to wet my paper faster, and the larger brush obviously covers more of the paper, so that's why I switched to a larger wash brush. And then the next round 8 stiffer brush, I call it a stiffer brush because this brush doesn't really have a name yet, and it doesn't exist on the market yet, so it's not available. It's something that I am testing at the moment. So any round 8 brush that's a little stiffer will work, unless you prefer overall softer brushes, then you could go with a round 8 Black Velvet series. And I used Arches cold pressed watercolor paper, 300 pounds, the square shape, so 12 by 12. You definitely don't have to paint on a 300 pounds watercolor paper. You could go with the regular 140 pounds. That's totally fine. Just with the thicker watercolor papers, like 300 pounds, you always have like more time to work the areas, at least in my experience, because the paper takes longer to dry. And this is the screenshot of my working palette, so you always know what colors are placed where on my palette. And this is a plastic palette by Richson. I always like to create a white frame for my paintings, and this is a washi tape MT brand. So this washi tape is from Japan. I love it and I highly recommend it. So I just tape my paper, and the only parts that are really touching the glass, my glass top, are the corners. So this is a flat brush, stroke 3/4, series Heritage, and I'm starting to wet the paper with this brush, but I am actually going to switch to a larger brush. So this is a flat wash 1.5 inch size, and it's just because it's faster. Basically, it's faster to just wet the entire paper. I don't have to omit, and I'm not trying to omit any areas. I'm basically wetting the entire paper, and it took about 2 minutes to wet this paper. So I'm just telling you this now because I'm kind of fast forwarding parts of it, so skipping actually for parts of it, just to save some time, because all it is just wetting the paper. But flat stroke 3/4 brush. So back to this brush, and this is yellow ochre and quinacridone red, and I'm starting off with that sky portion, right? So I need something there. I don't want it to just be like paper white, and this is basically what I can pick up, like these colors, very warm colors in the sky area. So that's why I chose the quinacridone red and yellow ochre, which are very like basic for me because I always go with these colors anyways. But so I'm also using these colors for the centers of the flowers, so it's all going to dry very nice and smooth. This is all wet on wet, so the paper is still wet, as you can see. And I don't want to add too much, just a little bit, whatever I can pick up, like from the reference photo, wherever I see that yellowish, orange, like reddish color. So the stems and parts in the background, like the sky portion. Now I am pre-mixing 2 violet shades. So this is Cobalt Violet Light, which is a little more opaque, and then Permanent Violet, much more transparent. So I'm just kind of mixing them up, and then I'm starting to paint basically wet on wet, because the paper is all wet, and I'm searching for that shade of violet that I see in the reference photo. So I'm trying to recreate the same thing in my painting, so on my paper, and I'm searching for those lighter shades of that violet color, and now I am adding ultramarine light. So if you want to make your painting more like on the violet side, so not as much bluish, just try to, for example, at this point, grab maybe bright violet. So, or permanent violet. So just try to stick more to those 3 violet colors, and then add a little bit, just tiny bit of the ultramarine light, for example, because we want to have some of that blue anyway. So everything is really pretty much diluted with water pretty well, and still more like between milk and half. Sometimes it's just milk like ratio of the watercolor, and between watercolor and water, like how I mix the paint with water, and more of the 3 purples. So permanent violet, cobalt violet light, and bright violet. Still searching for those darker areas. And for now, I'm kind of omitting the area where those flower petals are, because I'm going to use a different brush for that. That's when I'm going to use the round brush, the stiffer brush. So for now, it's like I'm painting the background around these flowers. And the most important thing for me here is to make sure I don't lose the light. So for sure, the sky portion, the top part of the paper, will be all lighter, but also like there's parts in the area where are all these flowers that are lighter too, and that's including the flower petals, and then whatever are like the flowers that surround these 2 main flowers, which are more out of focus. The right bottom corner, that's all going to be darker, but I don't want to add all the darks like all at once. I need to do it all gradually. Now, at the beginning when we're wetting the paper, I said I did wet the paper for about 2 minutes. It is important to go over your paper multiple times with that brush. Push off that water if you have to off the sides. And the way I glue that washi tape, so basically the washi is along the paper, and the only parts that are glued to the glass top to my glass basically are at the corners. So that's the only area where the washi tape is really sticking out. Everywhere else it's pretty much along the paper, so I could put my 2 fingers underneath the side of the paper and it's all, I could lift it up easily. So the thing is that whenever you wet your paper, you want to kind of push that water off the sides, and some of that water will obviously go underneath that paper, but that's okay because that's what helps me to keep my paper in place and so my paper doesn't buckle. Now I am painting on a 300-pound watercolor paper, and whenever you do paint on a thicker watercolor paper, the paper obviously doesn't buckle, so because it's a thicker watercolor paper. So the thing is, where I was going with it is I took my time to wet this paper, so now I have my time, I have plenty of time to add this paint wet on wet. So as you see, like it takes some time to add all these values of purple, right? So that's why it's important to really wet your paper before you start painting, and it does help to paint on a thicker watercolor paper like 300 pounds because these papers do take longer to dry. So this is what I'm painting still with that 3/4 brush, and these are all the purples. So adding all these basically different values of a violet color and searching for like these lines, like whatever I can pick up, some of those stems and so on. I don't want to add too many darks to the areas where I see like are supposed to stay lighter overall. So dipping my brush in water, cleaning this brush pretty well, and I'm using different jar of water now because I need to actually use a different brush to paint the flower petals. So all 3 violet colors. So this is the permanent violet, cobalt violet light, and bright violet. And I'm using this brush because it has a nice point and it's a round brush, so automatically I can recreate some of these shapes of petals without much effort. And that's important, just to like do it effortless, without much of like thought to it. You're just creating lines. Again, we're painting loose, so we don't want to focus much on detail. We don't want to do it like normally, like when we paint roses, or like we take our time with each petal. This is all much looser, and basically it's like a landscape, so that's why it also gives us more freedom, like how we are approaching this painting. So there's another flower on the bottom there. So these are the 2 main flowers that I am featuring basically, but this is the same thing like in the reference photo. I chose these 2. There is a flower like behind that larger one on the right side of it, so you could also feature that one, or I guess accent that one more if you want to, but I decided to focus on those 2 main ones in the middle basically the most. So mixing those violets with the ultramarine light color, and I am still painting some of these flower petals, and it's all wet on wet. So I continue painting wet on wet because my paper is still wet, so I really took my time to wet it, and that's really important. So you can tell the way like the paint spreads. The paint doesn't spread as much or as fast because there is not that much water mixed in with my paint. I also have to like, okay, keep in mind, like as much as I'm adding all this paint over a wet surface, the surface is still drying, and I am keeping it more wet. So I moisturize it, basically I keep wetting it by adding more paint and so on, but some areas are starting to already dry, so I have to keep that in mind. It's all a matter of like keeping an eye on every corner of your paper and figuring out like, okay, can I add a little more paint here still or not? So it's just a matter of watching it and what happens. And so also we want to, in this case, avoid blooms. Like blooms are beautiful, but probably not for this painting, at least for me, because you might have a different vision and that's totally okay. You could create blooms, but in this case I didn't want any blooms. I wanted everything to have like a nice smooth surface and to have these colors nicely blended. So as I said earlier, the paint is starting to really dry, but I feel like I can still add a little more paint here and there, just to define some more of these stamens and just some of those, I guess, whatever it's sticking out, those plants. It's not just these flowers. So adding few more flower petals as well. And also, like, because I don't have that much water mixed in with my paint, and let's say I did touch an area that's already like drying, I still wouldn't really create a bloom because I don't have that much water mixed in with my paint or just on my brush. So that's the thing about like keeping an eye on how much you have on your brush. And for this most part, I am painting just with the tip of the brush, but I'm grabbing the majority of the paint mixed with water with the fullness of that brush, so the full head of this brush. And I continue just adding darks, and at this point I can tell already that I want to add a little more, so another layer, just a soft transparent layer of the purples over like the bottom right corner, just to have a little more there, and so it all looks like nice together. So this is the important part. Now what I'm doing, I added all this paint, and now I am lifting up because I want to add additional petals there, and those petals are going to be more transparent because I'm lifting over like a really well painted surface, and the areas haven't dried like 100% yet. You can tell like there's a lot of areas that are still like drying, just the way the paint has settled so far. So to lift up for these petals, what you want to do is you want to use a stiffer brush, and this is the round 8 stiffer brush that I'm using. You want to dip your brush in water and wipe it very well on the towel before you touch your paper, especially the areas that are not 100% dry yet, so not just the petal areas that you're going to like lift up. So if you have too much water, you could create a bloom very easily, but if you wipe your brush really well on the towel and you just lift up with that head just that's so rinsed out of that water, then you will be able to create these additional petals without any problems. And I can tell like some parts are really dry already because I have a hard time lifting, but for the most part, to shape my flower, the main one, I don't have any problems because parts of it are still wet-ish, and as you see, I can pull that paint as I am lifting to create really nice petals, to shape them and add additional petals and so on. So that's the beauty about painting wet on wet, when you have all these colors laid out there already laid, and then you're starting to lift up. And then for the second flower, I'm going for the second one, so more flower petals over that second flower. And this is the thing, when I walked away and let this first layer to dry, I really thought about just leaving it as it was because I really liked the way it turned out already, just that one layer and just lifting up. So I thought about just leaving it, but then, you know, it's kind of like not really me because I always like to add those additional layers just for more vibrancy. And I didn't really add that additional layer everywhere, just parts of it, just a little bit on that bottom right corner and left corner, I suppose. But for now, I'm still lifting up. So dipping my brush in water and wiping it very well on a towel. That's a really important step, that you wipe your brush very well on a towel before you do anything. And I'm softening up the petals that are on the top there, so that part is already still wet-ish. So this is where I could definitely create a bloom. So I have to make sure I just don't have too much water in there overall. And then just with that tip of my brush, I'm adding a couple more smaller petals, or the petals that are actually in the back. So I'm adding a little more, and take a look at my reference photo and just overall, like, am I happy with this, the way it turned out? And I am. So I'm just gonna, in the second, let it just all dry basically. So I am still fighting that little area. I'm saying fighting that area because it has dried, so I can't do too much unless I keep rubbing over and over that area. So I'm not gonna really pursue it that much. Just overall add a little water and try to spread some of that paint that's already there, just to soften up those petals. So let's let it dry. Let it dry and then come back to a 100% dry painting. And this is the same brush, and I'm going to work on that center of the flower. So I'm wetting, for the most part, the full head of it, I guess. But sometimes like I'm skipping the areas too, but once I start adding paint, it's really going to go everywhere. So this is yellow ochre and quinacridone red, and those are just the colors that I came up with by looking at the reference photo. And as I am looking now, I could have also added from the start bright violet, so that's optional too for you. And I am placing that color, the mixture of the quin red and yellow ochre, in some parts, some places. The important part is to preserve the light on the top, so the flower has more light on the top and then it's darker on the bottom. So like I said, like earlier when I was wetting it, I didn't wet everywhere, but then as I am adding really all this paint, it's gonna go everywhere. So it's just a matter of, do you want to wet the whole part or not? And this is just a little more darker colors, and I'm trying to recreate some of these stamens there. So with the tip of my brush, and so it's as if I was working basically with like a round zero brush. So you can switch to a round zero if you're more comfortable with that, and create some of these flower stamens. So just accenting some of them, and again, this doesn't need that much. This painting doesn't really need that much more to it. It already looks really good in my opinion. And I just picked up like a mixture basically of the quin red and the yellow ochre. So a little more of that and adding more. So as you see, like the bottom part is filling pretty quickly with all the colors. At the same time, like you can definitely add more paint on the bottom, but the most important thing is to keep the top part lighter because that's where the light hits. And this is where I'm adding some of the burnt sienna and the original purple mix. So this is the purple mix with an addition of neutral tint. So the bottom part is going to be much darker, and that's why I'm adding the paint, and I'm adding the paint over like somewhat wet-ish surface, because previously I started adding all this quin red with the yellow ochre, and now I'm adding some of that neutral tint mixture with the violets and also yellow ochre and quinacridone red, and some of that paint, the new paint, will mix with the layer underneath because it hasn't dried yet, and I want some of that to kind of mix in. But the thing is that I said at the beginning, like you might as well just wet the bottom part more, because you really just want that first tone, the undertone of the yellow ochre and quin red, and it can be more spread out on the bottom. And then as you're adding more of the quin red later and yellow ochre for those little tiny stamens, then you can start letting it go a little bit and add less. And at this point you want the bottom part to be more filled, so with all these darks. And eventually I'm just gonna add a little more water so it will all blend more, so it will just basically become like one thing, but not really, just the bottom part. The top part needs to still stay a little singled out. But as you see, like for the most part, that center of that first flower, it looks like it doesn't belong there yet because it's very much like wet on dry, and it has hard edges, so that's why I'll have to soften it up. So now I'm adding a little bit of that quin red with the yellow ochre over that and letting it all like take it all in, so it all starts to blend together, and very gentle strokes over that center for the second flower. We don't see that much of it overall. It's like it's hidden behind those petals that are more in the foreground, so I want to make sure we don't add too much of it there. And then on the bottom, that will have a little more darks, so from the bottom I'm adding those darks. And then the same thing I'm doing to my first flower, but I'm gonna really have to add a little more color mixture with water just to let it like become more settled, so it's not like singled out, because it needs to belong to that flower. Right now it sticks out too much. So for now I'm just adding some more line strokes for the flower petals and connecting them with the first layer that I just placed now, which was mostly that quinacridone red. And I'm adding the purples and just shading it. So again, the bottom part needs to be a little darker comparing to the top part, and the areas that are closer to that center need to be a little darker too overall. So using just the tip of my brush, and this is very transparent layer, as I am spreading what I already have and creating additional lines over the petals. So it's basically I'm accenting the petals that I already have. I'm not adding really additional ones, only like in the closer, the ones that are more in the foreground. I'm going to create a couple more over there in a second. And then the same thing basically here. So going over some of the petals that I already painted or lifted at first, and they just need a little more of a darker tone there. So accenting them more overall. So the reason I'm doing it is because I want these flowers to also be a little more like vibrant in a way, but to stand out more, because they are the ones that are more in the foreground. Everything else is supposed to be more out of focus. So just going over these flower petals. Now I'm adding actually neutral tint and indigo and to my permanent violet, and then a little bit of quinacridone red to that purple mixture. So basically it's just like a super dark purple color, and that's because I want to have more darks on the bottom part of that flower center. So I have like the contrast in there. That makes sense. And then just using the tip of my brush basically to recreate some of these petals, and then I'm painting the ones over the ones that I already brought out, like the petals, but then there's going to be like a couple more in the foreground. So for now it's just a couple more lines because I have the darker values of those purples and I need to go over the lighter ones, and then it's just to shape them more and just to add darker values overall. But here is a piece that I'm adding now. It's just another flower petal. So these are the ones that I'm adding like an addition. So there are just the smaller ones like in there. But I don't need to add really that much more. After all, this is just a finished painting. I just need to, I guess, I need to add a little more color on the bottom. I don't have to, but I just decided to make it a little more like vibrant in a way, but just to bring out more of those violets. So more darks around those smaller petals in the foreground, and then some of these darks in the back, but I can't add too much really. It's just these parts would be more shadowed because there would be more folded. If you feel more comfortable like painting with a smaller brush, this is totally fine to switch to a smaller brush, because I am really painting with just that tip of the brush and just bringing in more of the darker values of the similar colors. So if you're like painting monochromatic painting, so let's say this would be like a monochromatic and just violet colors, then all you would do is just you would keep adding that additional layer over a dry layer basically, and just by adding the darker values you would create that fullness of a flower. So it's similar, although I am mixing different colors together, different violets, and then with an addition of the ultramarine light, although that's like an addition to actually create even darker values of the purple. And the same thing whenever I add basically the indigo and neutral tint. It's just the center of the flowers that have some of that yellow ochre and quinacridone red, well, and also the sky portion, because I wanted to keep it much warmer. So more of those darker values basically of that basically like a peachy-like color. So the mixture of quin red and yellow ochre is peach-like, shade of a peach-like, I guess, whatever it is. That's one of the color mixes that I use a lot, and it's not just to paint the flowers, but also whenever like I paint sand, like seascapes, right? Or skin tones. I do mix a lot these two colors together overall. So dipping my brush in water and then grabbing a little more. So this is quinacridone red and yellow ochre, and darkening up the center of the flower again. And this surface is wet, like it has not dried. So whatever I'm adding, I have to be careful to, first of all, not to have too much water mixed in with my paint, because the water would just push everything towards the sides. So if I was placing it in the center, now I'm lifting up just because I want to open up the center of that center, so the center of the flower. So I want to have more light in there, but also I'm lifting up because I want it to look softer, so it looks like it belongs to that flower. So at first when I painted it, if you remember, like, or go back in the video, you will see like how it was like standing out. That center was standing out and it had a whole bunch of like hard edges. So I didn't want that. I wanted it to like look like it belongs to this flower. So I had to soften it up, and I'm still going to soften up even more. But before I continue talking about that, I don't want to miss this part. I am actually adding darker values over the bottom part of the flower. So I have to make sure like it's the surface is dry when I'm painting now, but at the same time what I'm going to really do is I'm going to use a wet brush, and I'm gonna once the paint settles in these areas, I'm going to wet it, and then I'm going to add actually more paint. So I'm gonna add way more paint, and now I'm kind of adding more water. It's like lifting up, but I'm actually adding a little water there at the same time, just to soften it up and open up some of my petals so I don't lose them. So I need to lift up a little bit some of these petals just to make sure they're there, because I was adding quite a bit of color in there overall to that center. And then lifting up the bottom ones as well, lifting it up, and it's like adding water, but not that much water because I'm wiping my brush first on a towel. So it's more about lifting up overall. And this is the moment that I am actually going to wet now the bottom part. So I waited like 30 seconds maybe until this paint settles, so around those stamens. And now I'm adding water, not directly really going over these stamens, not directly, actually just going next to it and letting some of that paint bleed towards the background. So I need to have more color on my palette so I can continue painting. So I needed to add permanent violet and bright violet. So this time just the two violets that I like the most here. And this is back to the 3/4 brush, and I need to darken it up, darken up the value. So I'm adding some of the indigo neutral tint with the bright violet permanent violet. So this is all still wet on wet because I just wetted that surface with that flat wash brush, the large brush. And I'm adding these colors, and my goal here is so the colors dry smooth. So that's why I wetted that part of the background first. I don't want any hard edges here. So overall, like, I'm using the shape of this brush to paint some of these stamens there at the same time, and then there's some of the ultramarine light too, so I'm adding also more of that bluish. So this is optional for you. If you want to keep it more on the violet side, then I wouldn't at this point add any more blue. But just to darken up the bottom part, I do need some of the neutral tint and indigo overall, and just searching for the areas where I can add those darks. And again, I do need that surface to be wet before I do that, so make sure it's all wet so you don't have really those hard edges. Now I dipped my brush in water, the flat 3/4 brush, and I wiped it first on a towel a little bit, but then so I don't have too much water. And now I am still like wetting the surface in a way and spreading what I have, but very gently. So this is some of the permanent violet, bright violet, and adding a little more color over the wetted surface. So I just wetted that part, but I needed a little more darks also in the left bottom corner. So now water, and I'm softening up those edges because I really don't want here at this point any hard edges. I want everything to dry smooth. It's just a loose painting, and I really want to keep it very loose. And overall it's loose. Even I focused a little more on those flowers, the flower petals there, but going very gently next to my flowers. And this is for the most part a very transparent layer of those purples there. and then just water here at this point, just water very gently, and I'm grabbing clean water. Clean water is right next to my jar with the purple water. So I'm just pushing the water on the side because I'm done here. I just need to remove my washi tape. The washi tape really comes off easily, and it is one of the best washi tapes out there, and this is the MT from Japan washi tape that I buy from Amazon. Thank you so much, guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.